In this video, I'm going to cover our zone menus. They're conveniently located in the quick access menu. There are two of them, and each of them have a plethora of settings and toggles. As we'll go ahead and get started, this may be a more lengthy video. I'm going to take my mouse and I'm going to hover over the far left rectangle. That rectangle, or icon if you will, is a representation of our primary zone. And if you hover over it, you'll see a nice tooltip where displaying primary zone menu, further text being default. If I hover over the next rectangle, you'll see secondary zone menu, further text 240 minute. So the difference, the only difference in fact, between these two is the time frame, which is therefore displayed in that tooltip for you. Another way to see it is to simply left click either of the icons and then hover your mouse over time frame, and you'll see exactly what it is right there. As this one stated default, default simply means the time frame is being pulled from the chart itself. So if I look just above, we can see that the chart is set to daily, and therefore the primary zones are also going to be set to daily. Whereas the secondary zones, if I hover over time frame, we can see that the secondary zones are set to 240 minute. So again, they're two different time frame zones working simultaneously. We'll come back to the secondary here in a moment. I just want to start going step by step through the primary zones first. So now that we understand the difference between the primary and secondary simply being a different time frame, let's go ahead and move into that. There's one further setting that I want to discuss, actually two. Default allows us, as we discussed, to use the chart. However, what if we don't want to do that? You saw this in the secondary zones where we were using 240 minute. However, what about other time frames? So if we left click the down arrow, we'll see multiple options there, in which case we can select any. I'm on a daily chart now, and if I wanted to see monthly zones, I could simply left click the month option. However, now I need to make an alteration to my value. This input field here, where you currently see 60, is a representation of the value itself, not of the amount of data being loaded. For all intents and purposes, if I were to left click reload settings right now, it is going to reload 60-month settings. In other words, every single bar would be a representation of 60 months. As you may or may not know, that's not something that we would typically, if ever, do. So what I would want to do is go here and make sure I apply a value of 1. Now, by going out and left-clicking reload settings, each bar would be a representation of 1 month. So we want to make sure that we understand that setting very well. What if I wanted to see 60-minute zones? Well, in that case, I would left-click, select the minute option, and then I would need to replace my 1 with a value of 60. So now when I left-click reload settings, I will indeed see 60-minute zones. I'm going to take this back to default and just continue moving forward. Again, anytime we make that change, we can simply left-click reload settings, and we're all set. It will do the work for us. Let's move into the zone controls. There's a number one setting, which is zones on top. Currently this is set to off, as you can see. When it is toggled on, you will indeed see a check mark to the left of it, as you do with the bottom three. In order to accommodate priority, we needed to offer a setting that allowed us to pull either the primary or the secondary zones to the top. In other words, we need to make them prioritized so that we can see those particular zones. There will be times where zones overlap zones and so on, and you're going to need to pull the smaller time frame most likely to the front so that you're able to see them and they're not hidden behind the larger zones. I can give an example of this. If I click away, let's go ahead, and what we're going to do here is enable or toggle on our active zones of the secondary, and as you can see, you can actually see every single one of those zones. However, if I were to select the primary zones, being that they are the larger zones, and I were to apply those on top, now if you notice there's a bit of difficulty with seeing some of the zones. So let's go back and apply the zones on top. I'll do it once more. What I really want to bring your attention to, the most obvious of the bunch, would be this lower zone here. So I want to bring your attention to that lower, smaller time frame zone. And if you notice, you can't really see it right now. So this is the exact reason we wanted to be able to prioritize that and allow either of the zone types to be on top. So now that I've brought those back to the front, you can indeed see that smaller time frame zone. Continuing moving forward, we can look at the remaining zone controls. Here we have price labels. Again, the toggle does indeed have a check mark, so you see that it is on. Price labels can be removed at any time by a left click. And as you'll see, it will remove the price labels for the corresponding zone type. In other words, here we're looking at the primary zones, and as you can see, it did not impact the secondary zones. So you can still see the labels. These are differentiated in the code, and therefore anything that is applicable to the primary will not impact the secondary, as well as vice versa. So I can toggle those back on. I can go over here and I can toggle my secondary price labels on or off as well. So as we can see, there is no impact either way. What I'm going to do is toggle these off for video purposes. I think it will be a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. Now we're going to look at the resize and zone button options. Resize zones is exactly what it sounds like. It gives the ability to manipulate the zone size in itself. And I'll look at this and give an example here in just a moment. The next thing I want to look at is the zone buttons. The zone buttons, that is its own user interface, in which we will discuss further in the presentation, much more in depth. For now, let's note that both the resize as well as the zone buttons are indeed toggled on. In that case, to activate a zone, all I have to do is left click the exterior of any particular zone, and you'll notice the user interface pops up. And what you'll also notice is that there's these small circles on each corner, and in which case I can drag and manipulate the zone any way I want to, so long as that option is indeed enabled. So you can see that both of those are enabled and they're both functioning. However, if I go up, I left click zone controls and disable those options, I'm going to go back onto the chart, and perhaps you can hear my mouse clicking, in which case there is no zone functionality. You may ask why we would want that. The great thing about that is, in the event that you like to click or drag over the chart quite frequently, you may decide that you want to disable this so you don't accidentally manipulate a zone. Now we're going to move into the zone types. Within both the primary and the secondary zones, we have individual zone types. Let's go ahead and differentiate those now. We can start with the active zones. First and foremost, I should notate that each and every zone type can be toggled off both to the buy and the sell side, that's to say supply and or demand, or you can also do that individually. So I could toggle all of them off if I want an empty chart, or all back on. I could alternatively decide to only show the supply levels, and vice versa. I could toggle the supply and only show the demand. So you have multiple options. Again, this can be applied to all of the zone types. So what is an active zone? This is any zone that has not been violated or considered traded through. What does that mean? Let's go out and look at the zone so we have a firm understanding of this. As current price is always what we use to determine this information, when current price moves up, supply is always above current price. Demand is always below. So in order for a zone to be considered violated or traded through, current price would need to trade above the top of a supply level or below the low of a demand level. If, for all intensive purposes, current price does indeed go above the high value of this zone, then it would be considered violated. Inverse to that, if price were to trade below the low of the demand, 23.16¾ in this case, that demand zone would also be considered violated. And before moving on to the remaining types of zones, I do need to make a special note here that active zones do include all zone types. Again, if a zone has not been violated, regardless of its type, fresh, nested, or hesitation, it will be considered active. So let me repeat that. If a zone has not been violated, regardless of its type, it will be considered active. So now we can move into the next type of zones, which is our fresh zones. This is any zone that has formed as a result of retesting a previous corresponding zone type. For example, if a zone formed as a result of retesting a previous demand zone, so demand retesting demand or supply retesting supply, that zone would be considered fresh. and that's what you'll see here. The next zone type is nested. Nested is any zone that is indeed nested within a previous corresponding zone type. So there again, if it is nested, a demand within demand or supply within supply, overlaid if you will, that's going to be considered a nested zone. Finally, we have our hesitation zones. Now the hesitation zones is any zone that forms from a continuation in itself. So these are typically found in the middle of moves. And finally, we have historical zones. Historical zones, I want to give you a great way of thinking about this. They're essentially the exact opposite of active zones. The active zones were any zone that has not been violated, whereas historical zones are any zone that has been violated. So I'm just going to run through this once more. If current price trades through the top of this supply level, that zone will go from active to historical. If we trade through the low of this demand level, that zone will no longer be considered active. It will indeed be considered historical. And continuing to move forward, we will have our volume profile. As you can see, there are several settings here, but we will walk through those for you. The volume profile is indeed order flow or volume coming from the underlying data. We've implemented multiple algorithms to display this properly and efficiently, and you'll see that here in just a moment. If I hover my mouse over volume profile, I can choose to show those just like we did in the zones. Each zone type was capable of showing both or only demand or only supply at any given time. This is the same thing here. So I could choose to left click show both, and what I'm going to see is the volume profile display within every zone. However, if I don't want to see the demand, I can simply left click that off, and I could toggle them both back on at any time. I could also show only the demand and so on. Currently, I'm going to leave both of them on for video purposes. As I move down, we have enabled currently show the numbers. Now, you're kind of wondering at this point, I'd imagine, what numbers? I don't see any additional numbers. I should take a moment to touch on the fact that we have incorporated dynamic text. Did this for a very specific reason. We prefer our charts to be very clean and user-friendly experiences. So if we don't use dynamic text, you're going to have rather a messy chart. So let me show you what this means. As you can see, currently show numbers is on. You can see the check mark. So what I'm going to do is just move my chart ever so slightly, and I'm going to extend that. And what I want you to see is how numbers are starting to display there. We can actually see the raw volume numbers at each block, which is very nice in assistance for finding the unfilled versus the filled orders. Of course, we can turn that off at any time if we don't want to see that. So let's go ahead and apply that. We're going to go down to our volume profile and disable the numbers. I do prefer to leave those on, especially since we use dynamic texting, font sizes if you will. It's just nice. I do like to have the numbers, but I don't want it to be messy on my chart. And we've essentially accomplished both of that. So the next thing we'll look at is the ability to show the value area high and the value area low. VAH is an acronym for value area high. VAL, acronym for value area low. And we can toggle those on or off at any time. The value area is displaying where the pungency of the order flow has indeed been filled. As you can see here, there's two displays or two labels that have now popped up. And inside of those labels, you'll notice where you see large yellow spikes. So if you read the numbers, you'll see that the pungency of the orders were indeed filled there within the value area. So I can toggle that on or off at any time. The next I want to move into is the point of control, acronym POC. You can see there also another label popping up. And also, if you notice, out of all the order flow here, this is going to be the largest number. So that's your point of control, meaning that's where the majority of it took place. That particular block is where the most order flow was filled. Continuing to move lower, we have extend VP, VP being an acronym for volume profile, of course. We can left click, and that's going to simply push it to the right side of our chart. A lot of people like this because it is visually appealing, and it really does help to really see where price is coming into the open or unfilled orders. You can toggle that on or off at any time. We could also extend the value area high and low as well as the point of control. So if I have those toggled on, I can go down here and also extend those and write justify them. Finally, we'll continue moving forward into the all data option. Now, the all data option, if you notice there, is going to make some pretty vast changes when you're looking at the profile in itself. The numbers are going to change, the histogram itself is going to change. So I should take a moment to notate that the histogram is a definitive representation of the numbers in themselves, the raw numbers. So the larger the number, the larger the spike is going to be. By having all data on, we're accounting for additional retests of that zone all the way up until the zone is considered historical and or violated. So what you're seeing here is accounting for all of this return data as well. If we toggle this off, however, we are only accounting for the order flow that was there while the zone was originated. So all data, again, will incorporate any retest or data that forms additionally, whereas all data off will not. We're going to move down into our volume ratio. I can actually go back and toggle my volume profile off for now. And when I hover over volume ratio, again, I see multiple options in which we will now cover. So the volume ratio, if I decide to show both or individual, let's go ahead and toggle those on. So I'm going to left click show both. And as you can see, we have this nice big table that pops up. And the reason it's so big currently is, of course, because we have the chart stretched. You'll also notice that we have nice dynamic texting here as well. So as your chart is resized, of course, the text is well. Now going into the volume ratio itself, let's look at what all of this means. We can see here there are raw numbers. We can see there's red and green, and then we have multiple table separations there as well. To the left side, let's discuss this first. The red is a representation of the sell order flow. The green is a representation of the buy order flow. So in this particular case, we can see that 1,424,686 to the buy side. So as you can see here, there's quite a bit more sell volume here than there was buy volume. The next we want to look at is the average buy and sell as well as the average total. The average is exactly that. It takes the averages of zones and it gives that or provides that raw number to you so that we can then compare this individual zone to all of the zones on an average perspective. For example, the average zone has approximately 1.5 million to the sell side and 1.2 million to the buy side, whereas in this zone, it's heavily overweighted to the sell side. 1.5 to the sell side versus this zone is 1.9. So again, that's a lot more. We can see how strong or weak the buy versus sell was, and also we can compare this, as I said, to previous zones as well. So this is what you have on the average. Now, of course, the average total is the total sum of sell and buy volume. We just incorporate that, add that back together, and this would be the average totals of zone volume or order flow at 2.8 million. So that's a pretty big number there. There are many different ways to use that, and many of our members have found their own unique methods of using it as well. But this is predominantly the way that we would use it to determine the strength or weakness of a particular zone, as well as how out of balance it is. In other words, are there a lot more sellers or a little more? Okay. And as we continue moving forward here, go back down to the volume ratio. Remember what we've discussed here with the ratio itself, and we also needed to discuss some further toggles for the ratio. If I select all data, this is a lot like the volume profile all data, meaning that it's also going to incorporate more incoming data as opposed to just when it was originated. What you see here is as I'm toggling this on and off, you can see that the numbers over here, our average numbers, as well as our buy and sell numbers, are actually changing. Okay? The reason for that, as I mentioned, is because it is incorporating the additional data as well. So we could leave that off, in which case this would only reference the order flow when the zone was originated. Now, the next thing that we're going to discuss is the formation type. Formation data. So if I have the formation data off, what is currently happening is the order flow is being accounted for inside or within the zone itself. However, if I left-click formation data, it is going to, as you can see, change the numbers because it's now including all of the order flow up to the point in which the zone visually displayed. Okay, so again, let me repeat that and perhaps even say it a little differently. The formation data, if the formation data is off, it only accounts for the order flow at the zone itself. If, however, we disable formation data, or excuse me, if we enable formation data, at that particular time, it is going to account for all of the data, the volume and order flow analysis, even outside of the exterior of the zone, up to the point in which the zone actually displays. Next, we have our zone type. The zone type can differentiate supply from demand. So as you can see here in the average numbers, we have that 1.5, 1.2, but if I were to disable the zone type, then it's going to change that number. As you can see, we went from 1.24 to 1.58 and so on and so forth. With zone type on, it is actually differentiating the zone. So it's only comparing supply to supply and demand to demand to get the average numbers. Again, if I were to disable the zone type, it's going to account for all previous zones. And finally, we have our percentage labels. Percentage labels may be more aesthetically pleasing and it may be easier to interpret. So if I left-click labels percentage, notice here it's going to give me percentage values as opposed to the raw numbers. So I can turn those or toggle that on or off at any time. And this is again a very personal preference. Some people prefer percentage, whereas some really like to see that raw number. So we've covered each and every setting within the primary zone menu. Now I'm going to hover over the secondary menu. As you can see, each of the settings or toggles, if you will, sub-menus and menu items, are all identical with the exception there of one. So we can achieve the exact same things that we did to our primary zones. We could do that same thing as well to our secondary zones. But again, if you notice right here, there's one additional item in this particular drop-down menu. So let's go back to our primary zone menu. And you'll notice down here there is no disable zones. If we go back, you'll see that there is. The reason that we've incorporated this is it gives you the ability to only view one zone time frame on any given chart if that is your preference. I've found that one of the most advantageous things about this is in the event that I want to look at very large time frames, I certainly don't want to attempt to load a very small time frame additionally. So I may choose to allow default zones in my primary. However, my secondary, if I am going to a monthly chart, the primary zones are going to load monthly zones. However, whatever I've told these secondary zones to do, that's what they're going to do. So if I've attempted to load 10-minute zones secondary, it's going to attempt to load 10-minute zones on the monthly time frame when you increase your chart. And that is a lot of data. So it's a bit unrealistic. We do not want to do that. Otherwise, we may choke our platform down or something to that extent. So what we can do is we can simply disable the secondary zones. And as you notice up here, it's going to be removed from our drop-down quick access menu. Now you only see one zone type, and that is going to be your primary. There again, you'll notice all of these are remaining.